May 1969. A remote, mud-slicked mountain designated on military topographical maps as Hill 937, rising violently out of the dense, unexplored jungle of the Ah Chau Valley, South Vietnam. The Americans call it Hamburger Hill, and to the exhausted men of the 101st Airborne Division, it is a vertical meat grinder with a living green canopy. The tropical monsoon rain is falling in relentless, heavy sheets, turning the steep 60-degree slopes into a vertical swamp of slick, deep red clay that sticks to boots like wet cement. The ambient air is thick, suffocating, and heavy with the vaporized stench of cordite, burning napalm, hydraulic fluid, and the sweet, unmistakable odor of exposed human flesh rotting in the tropical heat. A sudden, terrifying barrage of enemy 82mm mortar shells tears through the pulverized remains of the bamboo thickets, and within 3 seconds, an entire platoon of American paratroopers is pinned down in the open with absolutely no cover. The mud beneath them is running red, washing over the canvas boots of young boys who were practicing for their high school proms in Ohio and Pennsylvania just 3 months ago. A frantic young machine gunner crawls blindly into a fresh bomb crater, his fingers slick with gun oil, carbon summit, and blood, desperately trying to clear a jammed receiver, while the earth around his helmet is literally chewed into dust by automatic weapons fire. This is happening every hour. Every single hour, for 10 agonizing days, the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion are clawing their way up that mountain, losing 5, 10, 20 men for every 10 feet of mud they reclaim from a deeply entrenched, virtually invisible enemy. The American grunts are running out of dry bandages, fresh water, and clean socks. Their M16 rifles are jamming from the fine grit of the clay, and the medical evacuation helicopters cannot land through the thick canopy and the intense wall of rocket-propelled grenades fired from hidden spider holes. Inside this living furnace of noise and metal, a single ordinary green piece of American paper is tucked inside a left breast pocket, absorbing the moisture of a young man's frantic, racing heartbeat. To understand what that blood-stained piece of currency meant to the man who carried it, you first need to understand that this was never a story of grand military strategies, high-level political victories, or the sweeping historical overviews found in textbook chapters written by men in offices. It is a single, microscopic slice of a conflict that chewed an entire generation of American youth, leaving behind a legacy of unhealed scars, broken minds, and unanswered questions. It is a story about a fragile everyday object, a simple $1 bill, and the tragic, unwritten pact made between a group of boys who knew their chances of seeing tomorrow were dropping with every step they took up that muddy ridge. It is a story about the desperate, superstitious tokens of luck that soldiers cling to when the entire world around them is dissolving into fire, mud, and iron. And that story begins not on the blood-soaked slopes of Hill 937 in May, but months earlier in a smoke-filled diner on the industrial edge of Chicago, Illinois, and later on the iron deck of a troop transport ship, cutting through the gray, rolling swells of the South China Sea. The paratrooper who carried this artifact wasn't a reckless volunteer looking for a fight, nor was he an officer with a career blueprint already mapped out in his head at West Point. He was a 20-year-old draftee from the industrial blocks of Gary, Indiana, a boy who had spent his youth working the roaring steel blast furnaces alongside his uncle, a quiet young man who knew the heavy discipline of extreme heat, sweat, and long hours, but was completely unprepared for the raw, unpredictable brutality of a mountain siege in Southeast Asia. His name was Arthur Artie Loomis, and before the battle for Hamburger Hill is concluded, He will not perform an act of cinematic heroism, nor will his picture be featured on the cover of national magazines. He will simply survive when everyone else in his tight circle does not. And he will spend the next 50 years of his life looking at a crumpled, stained piece of paper, trying to understand why he was allowed to walk off that mountain, alive while better men stayed behind in the clay. Before the United States Army handed him a set of canvas jump boots and a silver parachutist badge, Artie Loomis's entire world was defined by the massive, smoke-belching silhouette of the steel mills and the heavy, gray rhythm of the Great Lakes. He was a creature of structural iron, soot, and hot metal. His family had lived in the shadow of the open hearth furnaces for 3 generations. His father's ears were permanently damaged by the deafening roar of the rolling mills, and his mother worked the night shift, packing spark plugs into cardboard boxes on an assembly line. Artie learned early that life was a series of hard, repetitive shifts, where a man kept his head down, minded his own business, and trusted the cold, unyielding stability of the machinery around him. His uncle, who had survived the frozen ridges of the Korean War with 2 missing toes and a permanent stare, used to tell him over a game of cards in the cramped kitchen. Artie, in a factory or a foxhole, the world is going to try to make enough noise to split your skull wide open. The secret is to find one small thing that belongs to you, one quiet corner in your mind, and you don't let the noise touch it. If you lose your anchor, the machine will pull you into the gears before you can even scream. Artie carried that heavy industrial endurance into the military machine. When his selective service draft notice arrived in the autumn of 1968, he didn't try to enlist in the National Guard, seek a college deferment, or flee across the border. He simply turned in his safety glasses at the mill, packed his single leather suitcase, and caught the morning train to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where the 101st Airborne Division was training its raw replacements for the meat grinder overseas. At Fort Campbell, the drill sergeants spent months turning the city boys and farmhands into screaming eagles, pushing them until their knees buckled and their lungs burned from the cold Kentucky morning air. They forced them to jump from 90-foot towers, to march 30 miles through the brush with 70-pound rucksacks, and to repeat the division's airborne motto until their throats were raw and bleeding from shouting. But beyond the official military doctrine of physical conditioning and automatic weapons discipline, the soldiers were participating in an ancient, unauthorized tradition that had been passed down through every generation of American infantrymen since the trenches of the Civil War. The creation of a short snorter or a luck-bill. It was a simple, desperate superstition. Before deploying across the ocean to a combat zone, a group of close soldiers would each pull a single dollar bill from their wallets, lay them on a table, and sign their names across the green ink of the paper. The bills were then exchanged or carried as a collective contract of survival. The superstitions dictated that, as long as you kept that signed piece of paper in your left breast pocket directly over your heart, the bullet with your name on it wouldn't find you, and the circle of names would remain unbroken until you all boarded the Freedom Bird back to the States. On the night before they boarded the military charter flight from Oakland to Vietnam, Artie sat in a cramped, smoky booth at a crowded enlisted men's club with 3 other paratroopers from his platoon. They were his world now, the only family that mattered in a universe that was spinning out of control. There was Sullivan, a fast-talking, cynical kid from the Bronx who had been a Golden Gloves boxer and carried himself with a permanent swagger. There was Kowalski, a quiet, massive farm boy from Nebraska whose hands were always stained with tractor grease, and who missed his family's dairy cows. And there was Doc Henderson, a 21-year-old medic from Savannah, Georgia, who carried a pocket-sized Bible in his aid kit and spoke with a soft, molasses drawl that could calm a room full of panicked recruits. They pulled 4 crisp $1 bills from their pockets, laid them flat on the beer-stained wood of the table, and used a single blue ballpoint pen to write their signatures across the face of George Washington. Sullivan's signature was large and aggressive, filling the top margin. Kowalski wrote his name in tiny, precise cursive at the bottom, and Doc Henderson placed his initials directly over the gold Treasury seal. Artie took his bill, folded it into a tight, neat square, and slid it inside the plastic sleeve of his military identification card, slipping the whole package into the left pocket of his olive-drab utility shirt. They raised their glasses in a silent, solemn toast, a group of 19- and 20-year-old boys binding their fates together through a 9-cent piece of federal paper, believing, with the fierce, fragile arrogance of youth, that a piece of green ink could ward off the flying steel fragments of a modern battlefield. By May 1969, the harsh reality of the A Shau Valley had stripped away every single ounce of that youthful arrogance, replacing it with the hollow, unblinking stare of combat exhaustion. Artie's unit, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, had been dropped into the valley via helicopters, entering a sector that the intelligence reports at headquarters described as a routine scouting mission. But within 48 hours, they realized they had walked directly into the heavily fortified, deeply prepared stronghold of the 29th North Vietnamese Army Regiment. The NVA had spent years preparing the mountain, digging deep, interconnected bunkers beneath the massive roots of the banyan trees, lining their trenches with thick teak logs that could withstand direct mortar hits, and clearing lanes of fire that converged on every single natural approach up the ridges. The mountain itself was a topographical nightmare. A steep, vertical ridge covered in elephant grass higher than a man's head, and a dense triple canopy jungle that completely blotted out the sun, turning the forest floor into a dark, steaming greenhouse, where the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, stagnant water, and ancient rot. When the order came to assault Hill 937 on May 10th, the paratroopers believed it would be a one-day fight, a quick push to clear a radar site. Instead, it became a slow, agonizing descent into a specialized form of human hell. The American artillery and the fighter bombers dropped tons of high explosives, napalm, and white phosphorus onto the ridges, stripping away the green vegetation until the mountain looked like a raw, bleeding scab of red clay, covered in the blackened stumps of shattered trees. The mud became an active, malicious enemy. During the daily afternoon monsoons, the slopes became so slippery that the paratroopers had to crawl on their knees, dig their fingernails into the clay to hold their ground, and use the bodies of their fallen comrades as stepping stones to keep from sliding backward into the deep ravines below. The battle quickly earned its grim nickname, Hamburger Hill, because the grinding intensity of the NVA defense seemed to chew up the American platoons, like meat in an industrial grinder, sending down a continuous stream of casualties who were covered from head to toe in red mud, gray ash, and dark blood. Artie's small fire team, the circle of names on the dollar bill, was already starting to fray into nothingness. Sullivan, the boxer from the Bronx, had been hit on the 3rd day of the assault, his shoulder completely shattered by an NVA sniper round while he was trying to drag a heavy ammunition crate up the western ridge. He had been evacuated on a basket litter, screaming curses into the rain, his large signature on Artie's bill now representing a name that had been permanently removed from the line. Kowalski, the Nebraska farm boy, had gone silent after a heavy mortar attack collapsed their fighting hole on the fifth night. He didn't have a single scratch on his skin, but his mind had snapped under the pressure of the constant bombardment, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at his hands, refusing to speak, eat, or load his rifle. Only Artie and Doc Henderson remained on the line, their faces hollowed out by sleep deprivation, their skin covered in a map of yellow jungle sores, leeches, and black mud. They lived on lukewarm water from plastic canteens that tasted of chemical purification tablets and shared small tins of cold sea rations while huddling in shallow scrapes in the dirt, their ears permanently tuned to the low, terrifying thump-thump of enemy mortar tubes clearing their barrels from the reverse slope of the hill. On the morning of May 18th, the 10th day of the battle, the sky was a heavy, white sheet of fog that hung so low it touched the shattered stumps of the trees. Alpha Company was ordered to make the final decisive assault on the upper bunker complex near the summit. The air pressure dropped suddenly, signaling the arrival of a massive tropical storm that would eliminate all close air support and tactical helicopter surveillance. Artie was crouching in a muddy ditch, his uniform soaked through to the skin, his fingers frozen around the plastic handguard of his M16 rifle. His chest was heaving with a raw, cold panic that made his stomach turn over. He reached up to his left breast pocket, his fingers feeling the stiff outline of the folded dollar bill inside the plastic sleeve. It was wet from his sweat, the edges softening from the constant humidity of the mountain, but it was still there. The small, fragile anchor that connected him to a smoke-filled diner in Chicago and a world that felt 10 million miles away. He looked over at Doc Henderson, who was adjusting the straps on his medical canvas bag, his lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer as he checked his remaining bottles of morphine. "Hey, Artie," Doc whispered, his southern drawl cracked and hoarse from smoke and dust. "You still got that short snorter bill in your pocket? The one we signed before we left Campbell?" Artie nodded, his teeth chattering from the cold rain and the adrenaline. "Yeah, Doc, it's right here. Still got your initials on it." Doc managed a small, tired smile that looked like a crack in a stone wall. "You keep it close, brother. Don't you let the mud take it. When we get off this ridge, I'm gonna make you buy me the biggest steak in Savannah. With that $1, you hear me?" Before Artie could answer, the platoon leader's whistle blew, a sharp, piercing shriek that cut through the low rumble of the artillery. "Up on the line, let's go! Move, move!" The paratroopers rose from the mud like ghosts from a graveyard, screaming at the top of their lungs to drown out their own terror as they charged up the final 40 yards of the slope. The top of the hill erupted into a wall of fire. The NVA defenders, hidden in deep bunkers that had survived the napalm strikes, opened fire with heavy machine guns and a rain of defensive hand grenades that rolled down the clay into the advancing lines. The noise was no longer a series of sounds. It was a solid physical weight that slammed into Artie's chest. The deafening, rhythmic roar of automatic weapons, the high-pitched snap of supersonic rounds passing inches from his ears, and the concussive, wet thud of explosions that threw columns of red mud into the gray sky. Artie ran blindly through the smoke, his feet slipping on the slick clay, firing his rifle in short, uncontrolled bursts toward the dark slits of the bunkers. He didn't see the muzzle flash of the machine gun that hit them. He only heard a sudden, wet slap next to him, followed by a heavy, breathless grunt. Doc Henderson dropped to his knees in the red mud, his medical bag spilling its rolls of white gauze and plastic tubes into the clay. A burst of heavy 7.62 millimeters rounds had torn through his abdomen, ripping the canvas webbing of his gear and turning his utility shirt into a dark, spreading stain of crimson. Artie threw himself into the mud beside his friend, his rifle forgotten as he grabbed Doc by the shoulders, pulling him down into a shallow bomb crater, while the machine gun fire continued to chew the lip of the dirt above their heads into a fine spray of dust. "Doc! Doc! Hang on, man!" Artie screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob as his hands worked frantically to unbutton Doc's flak jacket. His fingers were instantly slick with his friend's blood, warm, thick, and dark, a striking contrast to the cold, gray rain that was washing over their faces. Doc's eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a sudden, overwhelming terror as he clutched his stomach, trying to hold the damage together with his bare fingers. His soft, southern voice was gone, replaced by a low, rattling gasp that sounded like water boiling in a pipe. "Artie! Artie! It's cold, man! It's so cold!" He reached up with his right hand. His fingers caked in the red clay of the hill and grabbed the front of Artie's shirt, right over the left breast pocket. His hand left a thick, dark smear of blood across the olive-drab fabric, soaking through the cotton until it reached the plastic sleeve inside. Artie held him tight, pressing his own body against Doc's chest to shield him from the flying splinters of stone and wood, screaming for a medic, even though he knew that Doc was the only medic left in the platoon. He watched the light fade from his friend's eyes, not with a dramatic sigh or a final statement of heroism, but with a sudden, quiet mechanics that was identical to a machine running out of power. The hand on Artie's shirt relaxed, the fingers sliding down into the mud, leaving behind a dark red print that was the exact size of an 18-year-old boy's hand. Doc Henderson died at 11:42 hours on the slopes of Hamburger Hill, his blood mixing with the stagnant rainwater in the bottom of a crater, while the 101 St. Airborne finally overran the crest of the mountain above them. When the hill was finally secured an hour later, the surviving paratroopers didn't celebrate or plant a flag. They sat in the mud among the shattered tree stumps, their weapons resting across their knees, their faces hollowed out and vacant as they looked at the human wreckage that littered the ridge. Artie Loomis sat alone in the corner of an abandoned NVA trench, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold his canteen. He didn't wash the mud or his best friend's blood off his skin. He wanted it there. He reached into his left breast pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out the plastic sleeve. The plastic was stained with a dark, drying crust of crimson, and when he slid the $1 bill out into the light, the blood had soaked through the paper, leaving a heavy rust-colored shadow right over Doc Henderson's initials and across the face of George Washington. The signature of the boy from Savannah was now preserved under a layer of his own life, a permanent, indelible seal that transformed the piece of currency into a sacred, terrible relic. Artie didn't show the bill to the lieutenant when they were ordered to stack the weapons of the dead. He didn't hand it over to the personal effects officer when they finally boarded the helicopters to leave that cursed mountain behind. 2 days after this captured, the High Command ordered the 101st Airborne to completely abandon Hamburger Hill. Withdrawing their forces from the ridges they had spent 100 lives to claim, letting the North Vietnamese army move back onto the plateau within a week. The realization hit Artie like a physical blow to the stomach. The whole 10-day furnace, the loss of Sullivan's arm, Kowalski's mind, and Doc's life had been for a hill that was worth absolutely nothing to anyone but the statistics gatherers in Saigon. He kept the blood-stained dollar folded tight in his pocket for the final 4 months of his tour of duty. a constant, heavy weight against his ribs that rattled against his skin with every step he took through the base camps. When his 365 days were finally up in the autumn of 1969, Artie didn't cheer or join the party on the Freedom Bird. He sat in a window seat of the commercial charter flight, his hand buried deep in his pocket, his fingers running over the stiff, rough texture of the dried blood on the paper, while the airliner lifted off the tarmac of Tan Son Nhut Airport. He returned to Gary, Indiana, but the city he had left behind felt like a completely foreign country. He went back to work at the steel mill, taking the grueling 12-hour night shift, because the blinding light of the blast furnaces and the roar of the heavy machinery were the only things loud enough to keep his mind from drifting back to the slopes of Hill 937. The people in his neighborhood didn't ask him about the war. They were too uncomfortable with the anti-war protests on the television news, too eager to look away from the cold, unblinking stare that had permanently settled into his eyes. He never married. He never went to the annual veteran reunions, and he refused to participate in the local parades, choosing instead to spend his weekends sitting alone in his small kitchen with a glass of cheap whiskey, watching the dark smoke from the mills drift across the gray surface of Lake Michigan. By the time the 2000s arrived, his hair had turned a premature iron gray, matching the industrial slag heaps that lined the horizon of his hometown. His family noticed that he carried a strange, unbreakable ritual that seemed to dictate his entire emotional existence. Every year on the 18th of May, the anniversary of the final bloody assault, Artie would lock the door to his small house, unplug his telephone, and sit at his kitchen table under the light of a single bare bulb. He would reach into his shirt pocket, pull out an old plastic sleeve, and gently unfold a single $1 bill that was now brittle, yellowed, and discolored by decades of age. The bill was covered in a dark, greenish-brown stain that completely blotted out the center of the paper. But through the crust of 3-decade-old blood, the signatures of the 4 boys from Fort Campbell were still visible in the dim light. He would place his calloused finger directly over Doc Hence's initials, close his eyes, and let the quiet walls of his Indiana kitchen dissolve. He would listen to the rhythmic, heavy clanking of the rolling mills outside, transforming and forming the sound in his mind into the thump-thump of the mortar tubes, holding the piece of paper in his palms until the sun came up, using the relic as a key to spend a night with the only brothers who had ever truly known his soul. He kept the watch over those names until his own heart began to fail, a victim of the invisible poisons of Agent Orange that he had inhaled on that ridge, a slow-motion casualty of a war that refused to let him go. In the summer of 2018, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across his porch, Artie closed his eyes for the last time at the age of 69. It was only then, 50 years after he had first signed his name in that smoky Kentucky booth, that the final watch was lifted. When his nephew cleared out the quiet house, he found the old plastic sleeve hidden away in a small steel toolbox. Through the faded, 50-year-old rust-colored crust, the names were still there, bound together on a single green canvas of paper. The official military histories would publish grand, multi-volume books about the campaign in the A-Shau Valley, detailing ammunition expenditures, target coordinates, and casualty figures calculated by mechanical computers in Saigon. The generals would receive their polished medals, and the politicians would write their lucrative memoirs about strategic defense, territorial containment, and peace with honor. The veterans of Hamburger Hill knew the bureaucracy would simply wait for them to die of their cancers or their own broken hearts before acknowledging the raw, unfiltered truth of what happened on those slopes. But the truth didn't require a marble monument in Washington, D.C., or a speech by a governor to exist. It didn't care about who won the hill or who abandoned the ridge. It existed in the permanent, pocket-sized ledger of a 19-year-old's survival. It existed in the fragile, blood-stained paper of a single $1 bill hidden in a steel box. A silent piece of currency that had stopped being money and had become a monument to a circle of names that only one old man was left to remember. If you had been in Artie's position on that mountain, would you have carried that blood-stained, short-snorter bill for the rest of your life as a reminder of the boys you left behind? Or would you have spent it or buried it to rid yourself of the ghost? Does an everyday object carry the soul and the sacrifice of its owners? Or is it just a piece of stamped paper? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more raw stories that peel back the myths of military glory to find the human heart underneath, make sure to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and let's discover history together.